So we're talking marketing, market access and trade with Stephen Christ from Sheep Producers Australia. And Sheep Producers is the peak industry body. So how is a peak industry body involved in these interactions, Stephen?
Yeah, the role of the peak industry bodies are, I suppose, quite varied. Now, I suppose the technical answer is that Sheep Producers Australia, as the peak producer body, is actually involved under an Act of Parliament, the Australian Meat Industry Act, or the AMLI Act. It is the prescribed body to inform policy and strategy on how levy payers' funds are spent. This is a direct function in terms of a service provider like MLA or even AHA, but MLA has a marketing budget for both domestic and international use. So the strategy on how that is spent and where that is spent, obviously we take a massive amount of technical advice from MLA and the market focus, but the strategy of which markets are growing and matching that to the supply of the product, that's where the peak bodies get involved in reviewing that and making sure that our levy funds are spent in the most cost-effective manner. Usually it's only a slight shift in focus and where we put our in-country resources, which can be absolutely vital in opening a market or retaining a market. Obviously, we've been in a very low supply situation at the moment, so we have been shifting our resources away from a growth market. There's no point in promoting a new market and trying to grow a market when you haven't got the product. So this is a great time to focus on those non-tariff barriers. And that's this kind of focus shift and policy strategic direction. That's where a peak body such as Sheep Producers Australia comes in our discussions with our service provider. The peak body also engages with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade to ensure that sheep meat is a priority in any of the trade negotiations where market access has been lacking. I mean, there's a classic case happening right now with the EU. Australia's had very low allocation into the EU, embarrassingly so. At the moment with the Brexit, it's down to a few thousand tonnes per year for the whole of the Australian production system. That's all we're allowed to put into the EU. So obviously with the current negotiations, we are front and centre with DFAT, talking to the negotiators saying, advising that obviously we would like liberalisation, but also pushing the position for sheep meat in saying that we must have a better access deal and advising what that might be. This is especially important if we're having a free trade negotiation in an area or country or region that has a significant number of consumers of sheep meat. So obviously we would love access to India, which is a very difficult market to crack, but there are a lot of sheep meat eaters in that market. So it's, I suppose, one of the holy grails of market access, and we would like to see what Australia can do on a bilateral basis or as part of a multilateral agreement. And we're in constant talks about DFAT about how we can engage better with certain markets. They're just examples. Obviously, there's multiple markets that we look at every year. SBA would also be involved if there are additional non-tariff barriers placed on sheep meat. This directly affects exporters, but it also affects the farm gate price and what exporters can afford to pay us. In the case of the Middle East, this is a particularly good example. In the case of sheep meat, expiry dates have just been lengthened on our product for access into that market, which means we have increased ability to put chilled sheep meat into that market, especially via sea freight. You now have time to get the product there by sea freight and have time to market the product before the product technically expires. It's a lot cheaper to put it in there by sea freight as opposed to air freight, and also just gives you a lot more flexibility. If something goes wrong in the shipping process, then all of a sudden you don't lose an incredible amount of the value of that product if you then have to sell it very quickly at a discounted price. There's so much that happens in that trade space. So these are the sort of non-tariff barriers where we would get involved and encourage government to negotiate a better outcome for Australian exporters, because it all relates back to what those exporters can afford to pay at the farm gate. And trade also encompasses anything that affects the ability of sheep producers to have their product consumed domestically or overseas. So, like I said before, this can relate to transport and shipping, but it also can relate to customs. You don't want customs having to spend a long time inspecting product or holding product on the port. It has a greater chance of something going wrong in the port, especially where you've got refrigerated containers that must be plugged in, or in the case of air freight, simply sitting on the tarmac because they're not actually in refrigerated containers. They rely on the dry ice. So it's vitally important that we have those customs relations, which a lot of it can be political. And so we need to have a very good political relationship as well as government to government and technical relationships. And that's where SBA plays a major role.